Hello everyone, and welcome back to Altrole's Class Breakdown series. I'm Bill, admin and instructor for Altrole, and today we're going to continue our Class Breakdown series to give you a general overview of all the classes in D&D 5th edition in a quick 30-minute video. Today, we're going to examine the Warlock, seekers of knowledge who make the ultimate trade with otherworldly beings for magical powers. Warlocks are people who seek knowledge and power at any cost, making deals with supernatural beings to gain these insights. While similar to clerics, who deal with gods in exchange for powers, the entities warlocks deal with are far from godlike. Demon princes, archdevils, fey gods, or even alien entities can act as patrons for warlocks, bestowing magic on them for the low cost of owing favors to these patrons. The transactional nature of the warlock's relationship with their patron often pushes them to travel around as adventurers, giving them the chance to use the immense powers that have been granted to them while also pushing forward their patron's goals. When it comes to their role in the party, the Warlock is not your grandmother's casting class. The Warlock puts damage above all else, with almost every aspect of their class benefiting their ability to kill in some way. On top of that, the Warlock also gets to choose a subclass at level 1, starting out with more specialized abilities and spells earlier than any other class. With unique mechanics surrounding their spellcasting and access to very powerful spells and cantrips from level 1, the Warlock is expected to be using their spell slots to damage and kill enemies quickly from range. Unlike wizards and sorcerers though, Warlocks have an easier time getting into melee, starting out with proficiency in all simple weapons and light armors, and having some subclass options available that make a melee focus viable rather than being a good backup option. So overall, the Warlock's role is that of a ranged damage dealer for the party, with subclass specializations allowing them to also act in a support or melee role as well. To help summarize the Warlock and clarify its role, let's go through a quick pros and cons list that I've organized into 3 main points for each. Starting with the pros, the first is that the Warlock has great ranged damage. Besides starting off with the best damage cantrip, Eldritch Blast, the Warlock's spell list is chock full of amazing damage spells that also double as control options. Plus, as we'll discuss later when breaking down pact magic, the Warlock is always casting their leveled spells at the highest possible level, which means the maximum possible damage dice are being used anytime a leveled spell is cast. The second main pro of the Warlock is that they have good utility options. Whether through spellcasting, eldritch invocations, pact boons, or subclass abilities, the Warlock gains a lot of options to control and debuff enemies with status effects. Plus, since many of these options are available as class abilities, they don't drain the Warlock's limited spell slots. Third, the last main pro of the Warlock is that they have viable melee options. Starting at level 1, the Warlock can specialize as a melee combatant and gains access to better armor, shields, and weapons. This specialization continues rather early on in the Warlock's leveling, with a good pact boon option we'll delve into later that brings with it more class abilities that make melee combat as a Warlock feel rewarding and powerful. So overall, we can see that the Warlock is a damage-focused caster that can specialize their class and subclass options to focus on either better casting or better melee effectiveness. However, there are some negatives to the class we need to address, the first of which is that the Warlock is bad at healing. While the Warlock does have 2 subclasses that specialize in healing and support, the healing they do get is very limited compared to other classes, and don't scale well at higher levels. Overall, the Warlock is not going to excel as the party's main healer, but can work as a backup healer if the main healer goes down. The second main negative of the Warlock is that they're still somewhat fragile. While the Warlock can get some options to buff up their armor class through subclass abilities and eldritch invocations, their limited health pool with a d8 being their hit dice leaves them vulnerable if they get targeted by an enemy that can't be killed quickly. As a Warlock, it's often more effective to focus on killing enemies before they pose a threat rather than trying to tank their hits. The final main negative of the Warlock class is that their spellcasting is complicated. Warlock spellcasting is different from all the other casters and can cause new players some confusion. As we'll explain later when discussing base class abilities, they have an extremely limited number of spell slots, and all their spell slots are always going to be the same level. This means that casting will always burn through the most powerful spells very quickly, which can lead to the Warlock feeling like all they can do is cast Eldritch Blast because they're going to constantly be running out of spell slots. So ultimately, if you're going to play a Warlock character, you need to make sure to manage your resources wisely. With the overview laid out and the pros and cons analyzed, let's now review the unique class abilities that the Warlock earns as they level up. Starting at level 1, the Warlock chooses their otherworldly patron and gains the Pact Magic feature. The Warlock's otherworldly patron, aka their subclass, details which type of powerful entity the Warlock bargained with to gain their powers. They gain new patron features at levels 6, 10, and 14. Patrons will be discussed in more detail later in the video. Pact Magic, on the other hand, is the Warlock's special brand of spellcasting, and has a few similarities and differences to spellcasting that we should review. First up, the Warlock is a Charisma caster, which means their spell attack modifier and spell save DC are both affected by their Charisma score. The Warlock does not get access to their full spell list, instead choosing a number of spells that they know based on their level. This number starts with 2 spells known at level 1 and increases at higher levels based on the spell's known chart. The Warlock can swap out 1 known spell when they level up, but must choose spells of the same level for which they have slots. Finally, with regards to Pact Magic, the Warlock starts with 2 cantrips known and 1 first level spell slot. Spell slots are different for the Warlock because all their slots are the same level. Their slot level increases to 2nd level at level 3, 3rd at level 5, 4th at level 7, and 5th at level 9. Unlike other spellcasters, the Warlock regains their spent spell slots on a short or long rest. At level 2, the Warlock gains Eldritch Invocations, fragments of forbidden knowledge that grant unique magical abilities. The Warlock gains 2 invocations at level 2, with more coming at later levels. When the Warlock levels up, they can swap out 1 known invocation for another one, assuming they can learn the new invocation. Some Eldritch Invocations have prerequisites which the Warlock must meet before being able to take that invocation. These can range from level requirements, to having Eldritch Blast as a known cantrip, to taking certain Pact boons, which are gained at level 3. Overall, these invocations are wide-ranging and offer a great amount of accents and customization to the Warlock's abilities as they continue to level up. At level 3, the Warlock gains a Pact boon, one of 3 unique gifts granted by their patron that further specializes the Warlock's abilities. The Pact of the Blade gives the Warlock more melee prowess, granting a magical pact weapon they can use alongside certain Eldritch invocations to gain extra attacks, deal more damage, or even use the weapon as a spellcasting focus. The Pact of the Chain emphasizes the Warlock's support and control abilities, granting them the Find Familiar spell and the ability to allow their familiar to attack in lieu of one of the Warlock's attacks. Eldritch invocations that require this pact grant abilities ranging from casting the Hold Monster spell at will, to always regaining the maximum value of healing dice when near the familiar, to the ability to see through and speak from their familiar. The Pact of the Tome supplements the Warlock's ranged spellcasting abilities, granting a Book of Shadows that, when held, allows the Warlock to choose 3 cantrips from any class's spell list and cast them at will, as if they were Warlock cantrips. At level 4, the Warlock gains their first ability score improvement. Ability score improvements add +2 to 1 ability score, or +1 to 2 ability scores, up to the soft cap of 20. Warlocks gain 5 ability score increases as they level up, and if the DM is using the optional feats rule, you can forego an ability score improvement to take a feat instead. Jumping up to level 11, the Warlock gains a Mystic Arcanum, a magical secret bestowed upon them by their patron. The Warlock can choose one 6th level spell from their spell list, and be able to cast that spell once per long rest without expending a spell slot. The Warlock gains more Mystic Arcanum at higher levels, being able to cast a 7th level spell in this way at level 13, an 8th level spell at level 15, and a 9th level spell at level 17. Finally, at level 20, the Warlock gains the Eldritch Master ability, which allows the Warlock to spend 1 minute begging their patron to regain all of their spent spell slots once per long rest. With the base class abilities established, we can see that the Warlock immediately gains a lot of options to specialize themselves through subclasses, Eldritch invocations, and pact boons that all grant a variety of useful and niche abilities. Next, let's take a look at the patrons that Warlocks can devote themselves to at level 1, to explain how these choices impact the Warlock even more. Now, there are 9 patrons available at level 1. I'm going to go through them in alphabetical order, but if you want to skip ahead to a subclass you want to know more about, you can use the timestamps in the description to skip ahead to the one that you're interested in. The Archfey is a lord or lady of the Fey who holds the secrets that were long forgotten before mortal races were born. When taking this subclass, the Warlock gains an expanded spell list focusing on control spells, as well as the Fey Presence ability. The Fey Presence ability allows the Warlock to force enemies within 10 feet to make a Wisdom saving throw or be charmed or frightened until the end of the Warlock's next turn. Further levels in this subclass let the Warlock turn invisible and teleport away upon taking damage, grant immunity to being charmed, grant the ability to reflect a charm back onto a creature trying to charm them, and eventually grant the ability to create an illusory realm, trapping a creature within range to be charmed or frightened by the Warlock. The Archfey Warlock focuses entirely on support and control, specializing them on charming or frightening enemies while casting other debuffing spells onto groups of enemies. This subclass gives the Warlock a variety of good options to choose from, both with class abilities and the expanded spell list, which makes it a good choice for a control-based Warlock character. The Celestial is a being of the upper planes, experiencing the knowledge of holy creation and existence. When taking this subclass, the Warlock gains an expanded spell list focusing on healing, radiant, and fire properties, as well as gaining the Light Cantrip, Sacred Flame Cantrip, and the Healing Light ability. Healing Light gives the Warlock a pool of D6s to heal creatures with. The number of dice available is 1 plus the Warlock's level, and all spent dice are regained upon long resting. Further levels in this subclass grant resistance to radiant damage, bonuses to spells that deal radiant or fire damage, temporary hit points to the Warlock and their party members when they finish a short or long rest, and eventually gain the ability to jump out of death saves with radiant energy, letting the Warlock regain half their total hit points, as well as dealing damage and blinding enemies nearby. The Celestial Warlock is as close to a support Warlock as you can get, gaining a good pool of dice that can be used all at once or one at a time to heal the party up while not sacrificing the Warlock's traditional ranged spell damage. While it won't replace a good cleric, the Celestial Warlock is a great backup healer or support caster for any D&D party. The Fathomless is an entity of the deepest oceans that allows the Warlock to draw on the powers of the sea itself. Upon taking this subclass, the Warlock gains an expanded spell list focusing on lightning and water spells, a swim speed of 40 feet, the ability to breathe underwater, and the Tentacles of the Deep ability. Tentacles of the Deep lets the Warlock summon tentacles on the battlefield, which can damage and slow enemies. Further levels in this subclass grant resistance to cold damage, understanding of other creatures when underwater, a buff that allows Tentacles of the Deep to lessen damage to allies, access to Evard's Black Tentacles and temporary hit points when the spell is cast, and eventually gain the ability to teleport up to 6 willing creatures up to a mile away in any body of water the Warlock has previously seen. While the usefulness of some of its features is heavily reliant on a setting near or around water, the Fathomless Warlock does have a lot of usefulness as a hybrid caster that has just as much utility as they do damage. Overall, I think it's an alright choice for any Warlock who likes it for its roleplay style or utility. The Fiend is an evil patron from the lower planes, ranging from demon lords to archdevils, who desire the corruption or destruction of all things. When taking this subclass, the Warlock gains an expanded spell list focusing on fire damage and control spells, as well as gaining the Dark One's Blessing ability. The Dark One's Blessing states that when the Warlock reduces a hostile creature to 0 hit points, they gain temporary hit points equal to their Charisma modifier plus their Warlock level. Further levels in this subclass let the Warlock add a d10 to an ability check or saving throw once per rest, gain resistance to 1 damage type every short or long rest, and eventually can teleport targets who are hit with the Warlock's attacks to the lower planes, dealing 10d10 psychic damage if the target isn't a Fiend. The Fiend Warlock is an interesting choice, retaining a lot of its ranged damage potential to nuke single targets with loads of good damage, but also gaining abilities to improve their ability checks and damage resistance. I think this subclass is a great choice for any player who wants a good ranged spell Warlock that wants to focus on killing powerful enemies. The Genie are powerful nobles of the elemental planes who enter into pacts that feed their own arrogance or expand their reach beyond their native plane. When taking this subclass, the Warlock chooses an element for their Genie, gain an expanded spell list with unique spells for each element, and gain the Genie's Vessel. The Genie's Vessel is a tiny object that works as a spellcasting focus, and lets the Warlock enter the vessel once per long rest and deal extra damage on attacks based on the patron's chosen element. Further levels in this subclass grant resistance to the damage type of the patron's element, the ability to fly for 10 minutes, the ability to bring up to 5 other creatures with the Warlock into the Genie's Vessel, and eventually grants a limited wish that enacts the effects of any spell 6th level or lower once per 1d4 long rests. The Genie focuses on the spellcasting side of the Warlock, granting a lot of unique abilities and replay value through the varied spells available to the different Genie types. However, these added options can potentially feel overwhelming to a newer player, so I would save this subclass for a player's 2nd or maybe 3rd Warlock character. The Great Old One is a being incomprehensible to mere mortals, holding eldritch secrets previously lost to entire planes of existence. When taking this subclass, the Great Old One Warlock gets an expanded spell list focusing on psychic damage and status debuffs, as well as the Awakened Mind ability. Awakened Mind lets the Warlock psychically speak with any creature within 30 feet, regardless of languages known. Further levels in this subclass grant the Warlock a ward to inflict disadvantage on attacks against them, gaining advantage on their next attack if the enemy misses, a thought shield blocking any mind reading against the Warlock, resistance to psychic damage, and reflection of psychic damage back onto the enemy, and eventually gain the ability to create a thrall from any incapacitated humanoid, charming them unless the charm is removed by the Warlock or through some other magical means. The Great Old One is a fantastic subclass option for the Warlock, providing great options for the character both in combat and roleplay encounters. While the Warlock's specialization into psychic damage may not be as useful in some settings, the Great Old One Warlock is the best option if you want to focus on psychically manipulating and breaking your enemies. The Hexblade is a mysterious entity from Shadowfell, which manifests sentient magic into weapons that tempt would-be warlocks with power and secrets. When taking this subclass, the Hexblade Warlock gains an expanded spell list that focuses on buffing melee combat, the Hexblade's Curse ability, and the Hex Warrior ability. Hexblade's Curse lets the Warlock curse a target for 1 minute once per short or long rest. This has attacks against the target do more damage, crit on a natural 19 or 20, and if the target dies, the Warlock gains hit points equal to their level plus their Charisma modifier. Hex Warrior grants proficiency with medium armor, shields, and martial weapons, and allows the Warlock to imbue a weapon with magic, allowing them to use their Charisma modifier for attack and damage rolls as long as the weapon doesn't have the two-handed feature. Further levels in this subclass let the Warlock summon slain enemies as specters which fight in combat and grant the Warlock temporary hit points, cause attacks from enemies afflicted by Hexblade's Curse to potentially miss, and eventually lets the Warlock transfer Hexblade's Curse from a slain enemy to a new one within 30 feet. The Hexblade Warlock is the subclass to choose for melee combat, granting better armor, shields, and weapons to use that are also accented by melee casting through smite spells and Hexblade's Curse. If you need a melee-based Warlock character, you can't do much better than the Hexblade subclass. The Undead is a deathless being that forsake mortality to pursue their ambitions, eagerly sharing their secrets of undeath with mortals foolish enough to listen. When taking this subclass, the Warlock gains an expanded spell list that focuses on undeath and necromancy, as well as the Form of Dread ability. Form of Dread allows the Warlock to transform for 1 minute, gaining temporary hit points, immunity to the Frightened condition, and frightening enemies the Warlock hits with attacks. Further levels in this subclass let the Warlock no longer need to eat, drink, or breathe, replace traditional damage of an attack with necrotic damage, add extra damage to attacks while in Form of Dread, gain resistance to necrotic damage normally and immunity in Form of Dread, explode with necrotic energy when reduced to 0 hit points at the expense of gaining exhaustion, and eventually can project their spirit from their body, gaining resistance to slashing, bludgeoning, and piercing damage, reducing verbal and somatic requirements of conjuration and necromancy spells, a flying speed that allows the spirit to hover, and the ability to regain health when dealing necrotic damage in Form of Dread. Now that's a lot of abilities. The Undead patron is chock full of amazing abilities that allow the Warlock to become a pseudo-shapeshifter, using the Form of Dread abilities to become temporarily more powerful during combat. With consistent upgrades to Form of Dread, the Undead subclass is a great option for Warlocks who want to unleash the spookier side of their spellcasting. The Undying is a patron that has found eternal life, seeing countless lifetimes come to pass as they spread the secrets of the ages to those whom they deem worthy. Upon taking this subclass, the Warlock gains an expanded spell list focused on life, death, and debuffs, as well as the Among the Dead ability. Among the Dead grants the Warlock the Spare the Dying cantrip, advantage to saves against disease, and undead who target the Warlock must succeed on a Wisdom saving throw or target a new creature. Further levels in this subclass let the Warlock regain hit points when succeeding a death saving throw or casting Spare the Dying, slows aging and removes the requirement to eat, drink, breathe, or sleep, and eventually allows the Warlock to regain hit points as a bonus action and reattach severed limbs. Despite having some cool lore, the Undying is undoubtedly the weakest of all the Warlock subclasses. While it helps the Warlock retain survivability by regenerating hit points, it doesn't grant any other abilities that make this survivability worth it. relying on base class abilities to provide any form of uniqueness to the character. If you want a subclass that focuses on survivability and healing, go with the Celestial Warlock before choosing the Undying. With all the class and subclass abilities explained, let's now look at how to build a Warlock character if you want to try one for yourself. With subclasses available at level 1, we can begin customizing our Warlock from the get-go, but we need to make sure we choose wisely based on the playstyle we want. For this example, I'll go through how to build a melee-focused Hexblade Warlock that uses weapons as the main source of damage, backed up by support spells for extra damage or utility. For their ability scores, the Warlock's highest ability score should be Charisma, to increase their spell attack modifier, spell save DC, and various damage buffs from invocations and subclass abilities. The second highest ability score should be Constitution, to increase the Warlock's hit points and concentration saving throws. I may want my third highest ability score to be Dexterity to maximize my bonuses to armor class, but with the Hexblade Warlock and medium armor, the highest dexterity bonus we'll need is a +2. The rest of the ability scores can be spread out as you see fit based on what you have available. Health is up next, and as always, very simple. To determine the Warlock's starting health at level 1, take 8 and add your Constitution modifier to it. After health is equipment. Considering we're going Hexblade, the starting equipment choices won't be the best possible options to start with, but we can still choose some good ones to get us going. For our Hexblade Warlock, I'll choose a light crossbow and 20 bolts to give us a mundane ranged option in case we get tired of using Eldritch Blast, a component pouch, as a focus would take up one of the hands we need for weapons and shields, a Scholar's Pack to get some writing equipment to keep in touch with our patron, and leather armor, any simple weapon, and 2 daggers. The leather armor starts us at 11 armor class plus our dexterity modifier, which isn't great but can be improved later once we find some medium armor. For our simple weapon, I'd choose the spear because it can be held with 2 hands to deal 1d8 damage until we find a shield. And lastly, the 2 daggers make for a good backup weapon or throwing option if we find ourselves in a pinch, but we can probably sell these early on once we get some more cantrips after leveling up. Now, before we move on from equipment, I'd like to do something I don't normally do. Typically, most characters will just take their starting equipment, but since Warlocks get a subclass at level 1, our starting equipment is way lower than what we're proficient with using thanks to the Hexblade subclass. Because of this, you may want to instead choose a starting gold option to buy equipment that's better than the standard starter equipment during character creation. The Warlock starting gold, not including gold from a background choice, would be 4d4 multiplied by 10, or an average of 100 gold pieces. With 100 gold pieces, we could buy a chain shirt for 50 gold pieces, a longsword for 15 gold pieces, a shield for 10 gold pieces, and still have 25 gold pieces left over for additional equipment like a Scholar's Pack, tools, or other useful items. This would start us off much stronger than the basic starting equipment, but I would only do this specifically for the Hexblade Warlock since we immediately get more proficiencies than other subclasses. With equipment done and dusted, let's now take a look at the level 1 abilities a Warlock player should note down. At level 1, we will need to choose our patron and gain our pact magic from them. Choosing a subclass at level 1 can be a big choice for Warlocks as mentioned earlier, but since we want to go melee, we're going to go with the Hexblade subclass. This immediately grants us the Shield and Wrathful Smite spells, Hexblade's Curse, and Hex Warrior. Make sure to note down all the requirements and benefits of Hexblade's Curse, as well as the added proficiencies with medium armor, shields, and martial weapons. Also note that with Hex Warrior, we can touch our longsword chosen earlier after a long rest to replace our strength modifier on our longsword's attack and damage rolls with our charisma modifier. For pact magic, let's get our modifiers down first, then dive into the spells themselves. For the examples we'll go through, let's assume our charisma modifier at level 1 is +3. My spell attack modifier is just my proficiency bonus plus my charisma modifier, and my spell save DC is 8 plus my proficiency bonus plus my charisma modifier. So, with a charisma modifier of +3 and a proficiency bonus of +2, my level 1 spell attack modifier would be +5, and my spell save DC would be 13. Now that we've got those listed, let's look at spells. At level 1, we know 2 cantrips and 2 spells, but only have 1 first level spell slot. Remember though, this slot regenerates on short rests too. Next, we navigate over to the Warlock's spell list and choose 2 cantrips and 2 first level spells from our spell list. I'd focus on damage and defensive spells, taking Eldritch Blast and Chill Touch for cantrips, and taking the first level spells Shield and Wrathful Smite from the Hexblade's expanded spell list. With those spells added to my sheet, spellcasting is done. Remember, the Warlock can only swap out 1 known spell per level up, but gains more known spells for most of their level ups. If something isn't working out on your spell list, don't be afraid to swap it out for another spell. And with all the ability scores, equipment, and level 1 abilities laid out, we have a level 1 Warlock ready to go. And that's everything you need to know about the Warlock class in D&D 5th edition. A great damage-focused caster with a ton of unique ability options to keep the class feeling fresh for multiple playthroughs. While the Warlock may be a bit complex for newer players, especially those new to spellcasting, it can also feel very rewarding to play as once it's mastered. But what do you all think? Is the Warlock a good caster option that can fill several roles in the party? Or are they just an overrated caster that's always going to be begging to take a short rest? Let me know in the comments below, or join us over on the Altworld Discord, which is linked in the description, to discuss it with the community. While you're there, feel free to say hi and check out our live courses that we run every week for free that cover any and everything you could possibly need to know to play D&D. If you want to help support the server and this channel, you can also check out our Ko-fi page in the description. We'll also be hosting another poll to vote on which class you all want to see broken down next in the Discord, so head over there before the poll closes this Sunday. Our last poll determined that the next class breakdown is going to be on the Artificer class, so ready your hammers and brew up some tonics for next week's video. But with that, thank you all so much for your time, and I appreciate all of you supporting us here. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and I'll see all of you next time.